Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think we can go ahead and get started today. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from. Let me introduce myself. My name is Emily, and I work for Teachers College Press, publisher of the new book, Applying Depth of Knowledge and Cognitive Rigor by Karin Hess. Dr. Hess is here this afternoon to talk about the book and her work in depth of knowledge and cognitive rigor more generally. We've got a lot to go over, so I won't take too much of your time. I'm just going to give a brief intro and some housekeeping, and then we can dive right in. Thanks to everyone who's already lighting up the chat. It's so exciting to see where you're all calling in from. Once again, Teachers College Press, we are the publisher of the new book. And behalf of everyone at the press, thank you all for being here. Most especially Dr. Hess herself. Thank you for sharing your work and your expertise with us this afternoon. Dr. Karin Hess is a former classroom teacher and school administrator, and she is well known as the author of the Hess Cognitive Rigor Matrices, which are now used in more than 100 countries. She's an internationally recognized leader in applying cognitive rigor, depth of knowledge, and learning progressions to the development of PK to 12 state and school-based curriculum and assessment systems. This new book that we're here to talk about today is interactive, excuse me. It offers a sort of self-guided journey to help educators understand and apply depth of knowledge and cognitive rigor across content areas, across grade levels, so that every student can experience deeper learning. And it begins with the basics, what depth of knowledge is, what it is not, and debunking common misconceptions about rigor. It's really a very practical book with tools and strategies for the classroom, all with the goal of planning instruction that shifts students' roles from taking in information to constructing meaning and monitoring progress with assessments that actually uncover thinking and so on. The book is perfect for pre and in-service teachers, instructional coaches, professional developers, principals. The list goes on. And for those of you attending today, we are offering a discount on it. As you'll hear from Karin in even greater detail, it's really an exceptional resource. And I really hope some of you will take advantage of that offer and see what it can do for your professional learning in your classrooms. When I'm done speaking here, I'm going to put the information for that offer in the chat. So please look for it there, make note of it, write it down. It's exclusively for this webinar. You won't find it on our website, so please write it down and please make use of it. Apart from the chat, there is one other place you will find the code, which is in a follow-up email, which we're going to distribute to all of you tomorrow. The promo code will be there, as will the recording of this presentation. So save that recording. You can refer back to it, share it with others. We really hope to give you a valuable resource in this webinar and show how these methods can help your practice and promote deeper learning, which, after all, is what it's all about. Last thing I'll say, two things. We will have a Q&A, so please drop your questions in the chat panel, and we'll do our best to get to those a little later today. And finally, please check us out, Teachers College Press, at tcpress.com. We have lots of resources for educators in all contexts. We offer these free webinars a few times a month. We have a very active newsletter, which you can subscribe to and keep up with what's happening. So once again, thank you for being here. We hope you'll check us out and follow us on social, get in touch. All of this you can find at tcpress.com. So on to the main event. Dr. Karin Hess, thank you once again for being here. She, once again, is the author of the widely used Hess Cognitive Rigor Matrices and the author of our new book. Karin, thank you for being here. Over to you.
Thanks so much. And that was perfect. She said she would take 5 minutes, and on the button, it's 5 minutes. I'm not that good with time. So welcome, everybody. I didn't see everybody's name yet who's on today, but I do see names of people I know. So thanks for joining us today. When Teachers College Press approached me about writing this book, I started with thinking about what I have learned over the years with depth of knowledge, with cognitive rigor, using it in classrooms. And I had to go back to the very beginning, but I started with 6 big ideas. The first big idea was that in order to implement anything, but any new program in a systematic way, you have to have a shared understanding of what it is. And so I focused the first module of the book on developing that shared understanding of what is the cognitive rigor matrix, where did it come from, what is some research behind using the matrix. And then the second which immediately comes to mind, and it's part of developing that understanding, was you always hear misconceptions. You go on the internet, you see misconceptions, and I've expanded that thinking a little bit more broadly in this book. But basically, without dispelling the misconceptions, then there isn't a shared understanding. My third big idea was this idea of learning transfer. And as I've developed my use of the rigor matrices, I've also read a lot of the cognitive science. And I believe that's at the heart of this work. I was asked recently by an administrator from the Washington, D.C. area if my work really just the focus is depth of knowledge. And I said, no, it's actually cognitive science. Depth of knowledge helps us to understand and clearly articulate what that might look like in different situations. But it's the cognitive science behind how do we get students to transfer learning in every content domain. Another big aha I've had over the years is that certain DOK levels build a foundation and other DOK levels shift the role of the teacher and the student and engage students at a greater degree because students are now developing their own meaning um, to questions that are being asked in class. A fifth idea is this use of my matrix to unwrap standards, develop performance expectations, and I try to illustrate that it's more than just saying, look at the noun, look at the verb in a standard, and suddenly you know how to teach it. And I'm going to take you through an activity that's in the book that really focuses on the idea of teacher clarity. We know from John Hattie's work that teacher clarity in being able to articulate expectations to students is has one of the highest impacts on learning. And then the last is about assessment. Sometimes people start with assessment. They want to design rigorous assessments. As a matter of fact, I was working a couple of weeks ago in a school, and I finished the workshop. They're actually digging into this book, and a teacher came up to me, a ninth grade math teacher came up to me, and she said, I always thought of depth of knowledge and rigor in terms of the assessments, but now I realize it's also about instruction. So that's the formative assessments. And most of the assessments teachers use are formative. They are assessments we use during the learning process. And so I've tried to put together tools that will help schools have a rigorous assessment, but also consider ways to balance the cognitive demand with scaffolding strategically. So that's how I started my outline for the book. And you'll notice also I have page numbers on my slides. So if you happen to have the slides and you want to go back to those pages, this just makes it easier to find them. So there are 6 modules, and I call this sort of a, design your own PD journey. They're standalone modules. You don't have to do them in order, but a good place to start is module 1. If you just have a um, basic familiarity with depth of knowledge, and maybe there's a lot of schools that download the rigor matrices. I make them available, but they're maybe not interpreting them or understanding them clearly. So that's a good starting point. Um, With every module, I begin with some questions that will be answered. So that's a good way to decide if this is where you want to start. Um, I also, with every module, have some links to video clips. Some of them are ones that illustrate teaching strategies. Other ones are videos from some of my workshops that I call my master class in cognitive rigor. And a lot of times when schools want to design their own PD for their schools, they find the videos really useful. There are also activities. So stop and try this, stop and write something, stop and discuss, and also opportunities to reflect. So each module has a slightly different focus. I've talked about a little bit about the first two. I get into instruction and how to do it in a deeper way and talk about learning transfer so that when you get to module 4 and you start to unwrap standards, you can see how you're applying some of the earlier ideas of how to develop success criteria for a unit of study, for example. And then probably the meatiest module is module 5. I have a lot of strategies, teaching strategies, instructional strategies for lesson planning. And then, as I said, the last module talks about formative and summative assessments and provides some guidelines and tools. So I want to go back a few years before the book was written to just talk about a research synthesis that I worked on with a colleague of mine, Brian Gong. And we were asked to go through the research and look at what clearly are the skill sets. So beyond the Common Core, what really do students need when they leave school to become successful in the real world, whether they're going to college or going into trades or whatever. And we organized this around 3 skill sets in our findings. The first skill set was telling us that in all content areas, kids need opportunities to engage in complex tasks. They need to build schemas. They need to understand the language, the procedures, the big ideas in each content domain. And this comes from the cognitive science. And they do this through critical thinking and problem solving. So this is this first piece that tells the fine arts teacher, that tells the home ec teacher, that tells the science teacher, that tells the third grade math teacher or the kindergarten teacher that all kids need to struggle a little bit. Productive struggle is an important part of learning. The third skill set, I'm going to skip over the second one for a minute. The third skill set is there need to be opportunities for students to have their own questions, to drive their own learning, to have the opportunity for voice and choice. Now, they're not the same thing. Choice might be students are allowed to pick which book they're going to read. That's choice. But voice is, after reading this book, what's the message you take away from it? That's your own voice. And so that's more of the creative, productive thinking. That's when students transfer knowledge that they built in skill set 1 to a new situation, to take away new perspectives, new insights. We don't have standards that say you need a new insight, but we know that when students are able to take from the learning something that's personal and important, it will stick with them. And then the last, and definitely not the least important skill set, is the ability to self-regulate. We can't expect kids to complete complex tasks if they don't know how to regulate their time, if they don't know how to be metacognitive about how they use their time. So we need to teach self-monitoring skills, peer reflection skills, self-awareness, and this goes beyond any academic discipline. In addition to this research, in 2019, there was a Gallup study that asked parents, what's most important for your children? Well, you notice down at the bottom of the list, and I call this near transfer, is when students are doing routine tasks and doing it very well, practicing what they've learned, memorizing facts, doing well on standardized tests. That didn't score very high. What was important to parents? That students have a voice, that they can reflect on what they've learned and express what they've learned. I'll talk a little bit more when we get to module 6 on not just assessing the final product, but assessing the learning process. This is where students can tell us what was important in the learning, how did they grow, what are they still struggling with. Those are important pieces to contribute to a student's body of evidence of what they've learned. They need to be engaged in doing new things, even if it doesn't work. So, FAR transfer is go out and try it. I like to compare far transfer to playing the game. I got that analogy from Grant Wiggins many years ago. Near transfer is going to practice every day and doing the drills, but far transfer, we're going to go out and play this game. Maybe we won't win every time, but we're going to learn something from playing that game. They need to have choices. They need to struggle a little bit, and they need things that are authentic. So they need real world problems to work on, and they need to drive some of that learning. Those are all important. And this is just a little research tidbit about productive struggle. This comes from Joe Boiler. Research shows that struggling is critical to mastery. In other words, if kids already know this, they're not going to even spend time on it. They need to have struggled a little bit to achieve. Think of home run hitters. They need to strike out a lot before they perfect being able to hit those home runs. Neuroscientists have found that if you're not struggling a little bit, that's cognitive dissonance, you're not actually learning. And also, a study that they cited, she cited in this paper, was that, um, for example, in Japan, students are put in the position of having to struggle about 44% of the time, where in US classrooms, it doesn't happen very often. The balance is you have to create a situation where kids are struggling a little bit, but strategic about how you help scaffold that learning. So here's an example of questions for Module 1. And as I said, Module 1 really introduces what is depth of knowledge, where did the rigor matrices come from, and it's worth defining what cognitive rigor is. My definition, and I'm sticking by it, is that it's partly about the complexity of the content. In other words, a lot of times people think depth of knowledge is about all kinds of rigor, but sometimes the content is just abstract, very complex. Then it's how we engage with the content. That's the depth of knowledge piece. So we can apply depth of knowledge to less complex content or greater um, complexity of content. And it's also the scope of the learning activity. So it's a combination of those things. When I talk about the scope, it could be a 10-minute activity where students are working in groups and asked to maybe find supporting evidence for a claim. But it also could be students are working on a project. So often the scope pushes the cognitive engagement to a deeper level and allows students to understand and interpret and unpack more complex content. I think high school teachers appreciate that a lot of their content is very complex. As a matter of fact, the last year I've been working mostly with high schools, and they are struggling with how to engage their students at deeper levels when the content becomes very complex. And so that's all about creating good scaffolding strategies to access the content as well as the type of task. Just a quick little overview. I've used these slides many times. The way I created the matrix, I started to look at Bloom and Webb. Bloom's taxonomy is about a type of thinking, often associated with verbs. Norman Webb came out with a paper in 2002 that said it's about how deeply you have to understand or interact with the content to be successful. That's different. I started with a close reading, a mathematics, a writing, and a social studies matrix. But over the years, I read that it's really important that each content domain has its own schema, and therefore I've tried to achieve specific examples, find specific examples, and build out the rigor matrices so that it could be addressed in the fine arts or health and phys ed or world languages or even career and technical education. So while they're all pretty much set up with an integration of Bloom and Webb, except for the health and phys ed and the fine arts and the world language, I've used other models for those, but they all have an integration of cognitive models. And some people have seen the UGG, but they haven't understood what it stands for. It actually was what a professor used to write on our papers when I was in a doctoral program, and he would write UGG if you stated a claim and didn't provide supporting evidence. Opinions without support are UGGs, and that's a low level evaluation. I actually created the first rigor matrix to prove that Webb and Bloom were not the same. That you could go deep in understanding, you could go deep in application, and just because things were at the higher end of Bloom's taxonomy, the revised Bloom is called the cognitive process dimensions, but just because something's at a higher level doesn't make it deeper learning, because you could just be brainstorming ideas, messing around with materials, not necessarily getting deeply into the content yet. There are 8 content-specific matrices that show examples of what tasks might look like. It's a range of possibilities. It's just giving teachers more than one way to think about it, not limited to these. But here's the next aha. I started to realize that as you shift from DOK 1 and 2 to DOK 3 and 4, you shift what the student is doing. The student is no longer taking in information. The student is producing information, building knowledge, constructing knowledge. That's huge because that's what learning transfer is all about. And that's why I say I had to understand the cognitive science about transfer to understand how a depth of knowledge level could help you see how to get there. So at the end of the first module, you have an activity where you test your understanding of depth of knowledge until there are examples given. And let's just look at example number 5 here. You asked your students to create a booklet of something, butterflies, types of architecture, styles of artists, could be anything. And you have to include some illustrations, description of attributes, and other facts about each example. And a lot of times teachers read that and say, wow, that's going to take a long time. The scope of that is really big. But when you think about it, I'm going to draw a picture or find a picture and paste it. I'm going to describe what that's there, and then I'm going to go on to another picture. There's nothing about that description that pushes kids to think more deeply beyond each example. There's nothing that says, how do these all examples all tie together? How have they changed over time? There's nothing in that description of that task. Some kids might do it. But here's the thing, kids are like water. They seek the easiest route to the lowest level of DOK. And if all they have to do is have a booklet with some pictures and a couple sentences on each page, most students will complete that. I ask you to think about the DOK level for that, and then what would your reasoning be? I say it's a DOK 1. It doesn't go deeper. Whereas number 6, you're comparing and contrasting 2 novels. Now you have 2 full texts. That's more complex to process. They're from the same time period. Now you look at historical accuracy. And now you're being asked to cite evidence from both texts and other sources to support your conclusions. I think novel A or novel B is more historically accurate. These are the reasons why. That's a much more detailed description of what students have to do, and there's clarity there. I would put that at a DOK 4. So it's a good practice activity. There's an answer key, and yet teachers still, even when they see the answer key, they still like to talk about some of those examples. So I know that it's sort of hitting a certain level of, I'm not really sure. I've asked kids to do this before, but often there's a complaint. I've asked kids to do this and they don't go deep. And it helps teachers to find greater clarity. Module 2, as I said, is about misconceptions. And so there are a few questions there that we explore. The key thing that I put into this module was an activity, and there's lots of activities. So there's an anticipation guide with some statements. Now, anticipation guides are powerful learning tools. All teachers should be using them. create 5 statements. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? So that's step one. Do I agree that all students can think deeply, or do I disagree? And step two is, and this is why I think so. So I'm pulling out my background knowledge at this point to say why I agree or disagree. There's no right answers here. Then, as they go through that module, they're asked at the end, has your thinking changed? Has it been confirmed that you agreed or disagreed, or challenged in some way? And what convinced you? So it's a good structure to use when we're asking our students, and it also works really well with teachers. Here's the way I like to do this. I like to set up a jigsaw, and I'll talk a little bit later about why a jigsaw is a great, great deeper learning activity. But each group reads a different piece, different about a different misconception. They talk about it, and then they present to the group. Not only do they summarize, but what new insights they take away about that misconception. I've used this in some schools in New York City recently, and they really enjoyed doing this activity. It allowed them to talk. Talk is a very powerful way to help the learning stick. Module 3, now we're going deeper. Now we're going to understand about transfer. So coming back to the teacher-student roles, you see in this side-by-side table that the teacher changes what he or she is doing in order to get a different type of response for the student. Teachers are asking questions that are very focused at DOK1. I want to be sure you get the little details. So what are kids doing? They're memorizing. At DOK2, now your questions are saying, sort these things, classify these things. Does this example fit in group A or group B? Show me examples and non-examples. This builds conceptual schemas. Now students are able to explain how things relate by sorting, classifying. They're able to make predictions, estimating, making observation, proposing questions they'd like to investigate. At DOK3, now the question is saying, why do you think that? How do you know that? Is that always the case? Now students are starting to construct knowledge. This is where far transfer kicks in. Because now it's not about the right answer, it's about how you explain your thinking and how did you get to that answer. Is this relevant? Is this accurate information I'm using? And DOK4 says, now expand the sources you're tapping into. Are there biases in some of the sources you're using? Is there an alternative way to look at this? And truly, this is when students are constructing their own knowledge, probably generating insights and new ideas, and maybe new questions to investigate. This is an activity that is from a colleague of mine, Brandon Dubeck, is coming out with a book, and I've been reading, reading behind him as he's writing the chapters. It'll be coming out next year. But he had this table, and I've been using this in my workshops the last um, couple months to help teachers understand the difference between near and far transfer. Near transfer is you locate basic facts. Far transfer is you support your ideas using those facts. If you see the little icon down at the bottom that has the coach, this is an activity that's a really good activity to use in your schools, where after they talk about the examples, they come up with their own examples. Something you're teaching, what would it look like if they apply it, if they play the game with that content? Module 4, and this one I'm going to spend a little bit of time just showing very simple strategy. Comes from a colleague of mine, Larry Ainsworth. He's been using my rigor matrices for quite a while to unwrap standards and identify priority standards and build curricular units. So we know that generating questions can be a way to tie lessons in a unit of study together. So now that we sort of understand depth of knowledge, we could start to think about a blank matrix. And you notice I don't try to fill in all the boxes here, but this might be a middle school example of looking at history and culture and tradition. This comes from my Rigor by Design book. But the point I want to make is the essential questions are way over up there under DOK4. Those are questions that invite student choice and voice. Students can choose maybe, again, what they're reading or what they're going to focus on, but really voice comes out when they're allowed to tackle a broad question, an essential question. So that's a piece of unpacking standards because we have to think, how do those standards relate to some of those bigger questions, those broader, authentic, real world questions? This is just a little slide that I've adapted from the work of Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins, where they talk about essential questions are broader, they're open-ended, they spark kids wanting to investigate. And if kids don't want to investigate, they're checking out. They're not engaged. So we want the essential question to draw kids in. It's got to be big and broad. It's got to be thought-provoking. So what's that look like? So in the book, I have this example, which is based on the work of Heidi Hayes Jacobs and Allison Zamuda. They came out with a book maybe a year and a half ago, about storyboarding, taking the curriculum maps and making them student friendly. So if you read the essential questions here, for Unit 1, where are we wasting water? For Unit 2, how do percentages rule the world? Are they broad? Are they open-ended? Do they spark investigation or interest? Yeah, it's not like kids are going to do something really boring in Unit 1, and then we're going to go on to Unit 2 and do another really boring thing. So the idea here is, let's create a way to present the curriculum to students, to parents, so that they understand not only what you're going to learn, but they also are thinking about, this is authentic, this is real world. So if you look at this is a good discussion question to have with teachers. Well, first you see a visual. So there's a real world visual, and that's important in the storyboard. You can draw those, you can locate those, take pictures of things. But then if we just look at the first description, we're going to start digging into equivalent ratios and unit rates from 6th grade. So I'm telling you how we're going to use learning from last year this year. I'm helping you make those connections. If you go into the book and you actually look below this are different learning targets. There are DOK1 learning targets, DOK2 learning targets, DOK3 learning targets for each unit. And then at the very bottom, you'll see a combination of standards that are being addressed. So I'm just checking to see, I saw some people weighing in, and just want to see if anyone was asking a question. I don't see a question, so that's okay. We'll get to question time pretty soon. So think about your curriculum maps. I'm actually going to do this with a school tomorrow. They're going to bring their curriculum maps, and I'm going to ask them, what's a visual that would illustrate the essence of what kids are going to learn in this unit? And then what would be a good engaging question for this? And now let's move to those standards that are part of that unit. So in the book, I take an example. I try to hit examples from different content areas. You just saw a math example. This is a science example. This is a way that Larry Ainsworth suggests using my rigor matrix, and I like it, to unwrap a standard. I like to first identify what are the processes that kids have to learn. So those are in blue here. And what is the content they have to understand? So instead of saying, what are the nouns, what are the verbs? Well, one thing they have to do is develop a model, and they're going to have to be able to use a model. What content is there? The function of a cell, the parts of the cell. So the first step is identify the things kids have to learn and be able to do. And then look at the Bloom side of the matrix. This happens to be science. So you see the little microscope up in the corner. They're going to be applying and they're going to be analyzing. And so there's things that are highlighted there. That's step one. So we're going to start there. And then the next step is now read across and figure out how are they going to analyze and how are they going to apply? Because we're really focusing on the what are they going to do? Remember, engaging with the content is what depth of knowledge is about. So now we're circling things under depth of knowledge too and highlighting. And the aha here sometimes for teachers is this standard really focuses on depth of knowledge too, conceptual understanding. Is everybody with me? I hope so. Okay, so what do we do with that information? Now there's a little table, and I've taken this same standard, and there's multiple standards in different content areas. We list the standard, and then we say, what are the skills and concepts students need to understand? So they have to understand function of a cell, how the parts of the cell contribute, how to use a model, and how to develop a model. Now we can develop the performance expectations. And you'll notice these have DOK levels. Now, some people are saying, but Karin, you just told us that this standard is written at a DOK2. That's the target level for the standard. It's not the ceiling. It's not all you could do with the standard. So I've got things below DOK2. Define the terms. What's a chloroplast? What's a cell wall? Retrieve information from a diagram to answer questions. Explain the relationships. Now we're at DOK2. Use models. Construct models. But you notice I also, in my unit of study, have said, I also want them to play the game with that content. I want them to conduct an investigation and learn something about cells. That's the ceiling. So depth of knowledge has a target, yes, but it also has a ceiling. You can go beyond that and actually transfer that learning and make it more meaningful. And then there's an opportunity for students to do that same thing with their standards. I say your students, I mean you're the teachers, but they've become my students. So included in this, and to be helping to help teachers come up with what are the possible things students would be doing for the performance expectations? How deeply will they demonstrate their knowledge? I've included my sketch notes. And I'm not sure who suggested sketch notes, but I know Norm Potter is on and Nate Auk is on, and there were people that contributed little scenarios to the book, and I thank them for that. But somewhere along the way, somebody said, you should have some sketch notes to describe depth of knowledge. It might have been Norm. Thank you, Norm, for that idea. So take a bunch of different markers and make a bunch of dots that are not connected. That's what depth of knowledge one looks like. Just build a foundation, practice memorizing things. Depth of knowledge too, I want my students to know more about what's in that blue dot. So the blue dot starts to get bigger when I say, how's this like the light blue dot? How's this like the red dot? What's the connection with the yellow dot? So I'm now asking students to connect that foundational information and build a conceptual understanding. They're still at that near transfer stage, but they're building out their knowledge and the dots are starting to get bigger and connect. And what you are seeing are some possible success criteria. I can explain relationships. I can organize or graph information. I can summarize the story. At DOK3, now the blue dot is even bigger because now there's more arrows. Now I'm connecting all the information. We're reading a novel and we're connecting how the setting connects with all the other parts, how the character interactions connect, how the motivations connect, and how does that build the idea of theme. And again, you see possible success criteria, learning targets. And finally, what happens at DOK4 is maybe sometimes the blue dot and the yellow dot actually start to connect and merge. And now we have a new color. We have green, and green might be a new insight. It might be a broader insight. It might relate to the bigger idea. It might be my aha as a learner. So we've unwrapped standards. We've built learning targets at different DOK levels. And now it's time to decide, how am I going to teach those things? How am I going to have my kids uncover credible information? If I have a learning target that says I'm going to revise my investigation or solve a non-routine problem, I now need strategies. So Module 5 is about strategies. And I always like to start with this question: how do you know your students are doing rigorous thinking? Quickly in the chat, type in just a couple phrases. How do you know kids are thinking at a deeper level? How do you know instruction is deeper, learning is deeper, or even assessment is deeper? And let's just take 1 minute and let's see what people come up with, because this is a great activity. I've even done this in places where they'll say, we do this from same activity from time to time and keep building understanding. So I'm just quickly going through some of the comments here. Thank you for the comments you're sharing. Okay, now I'm seeing they're justifying their reasoning. There's deeper engagement. They're applying. I like to say there's applying in a very simplistic way, practice the way you were taught, and then there's apply in a novel situation. So apply has a range. Creating something within the constraints related to a novel problem. Oh, I love that. Explaining their thinking. It is all about their thinking. And if we don't ask them what they're thinking, then we're guessing. I used to say, show your work. And I'd take those papers home and I'd say, what was that student thinking? Model and collaborative practices. Yes. Self-talk. You know, we teach that when we teach reading. Laura put that in there. And we do it with reading, but we should be teaching talk. And talking out loud about how we solve math problems, how we figure out how we're going to solve a science problem. That's interesting. Flow state, making new connections, something we never talked about. You can't possibly talk about everything, but kids have background knowledge, so drag it out of them. Teaching younger students. We always say you learn twice when you teach somebody else, and that's true of teachers too. When they had to teach it, they learned twice. Identifying misconceptions about their own work. That's a great one. Having kids work with peers to um, self-correct, get peer feedback, and modify. Okay, so you guys are all really smart. These are great. These are great. But you get it. And then what I usually do is go from here to say, so what's the same that people on your list that things are coming, and what's different? How does this all build an understanding of cognitive rigor? Remember, cognitive rigor is about the content, it's about the engagement with the content. So you've kind of hit those in your examples. And then I usually share this, what the research kind of says. Kids are making and supporting connections. They're building schema by taking things apart and putting it back together again, understanding how an essay goes together, understanding how experimental design goes together. They're generating their own questions. They're defining what the challenge is and figuring out a possible solution path. They're tackling complex tasks with peers. This is so important. Sometimes people think depth of knowledge is what you do by yourself. No, depth of knowledge just describes what you're doing. If you work with peers, and I say start small, work in twos, work in threes, don't have huge groups. But the research says kids can learn more, they can learn more quickly, and they can go more deeply into the content if they are working with others on a very structured task. So they know they're clear on what they have to do and they're able to work together on that. The learning is faster and deeper. And then the last example is when they stretch. So a lot of you hit those. That's great. I originally designed this as a poster, and there's a link at the end of this. You can download this and print it. But I also now cut them apart as little task cards. So when kids are working, maybe a group picks a card like the make and support a connection card. They pick that card, and then they have to make and support a connection. It could be personal, it could be source-based, or even a global, something going on in the world. I've included, well, let me go back to this slide. I've included examples of learning activities to help kids make connections, to help them build schema, to help them generate questions, and so on. So that's why this module is rich with ideas for teachers. But I also remind them this is what John Hattie has identified. So as you look at examples, I ask you in module 2 to do a jigsaw. Well, a jigsaw method, when you are working and learning together with each other and teaching your peers, that has a huge impact on long-term learning. Notice that there's other things, problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning, building schemas by mapping a concept, and so on. So I try to remind people always, this is all based in good research. Because remember, in Hattie's work, a 0.4 is a typical growth in 1 year. I've included things that are above 1 year. So you say, well, maybe that's all kids can't do that. But boy, if you are striving for all kids to think more deeply, then do more jigsaw, do more cooperative learning. Have class discussions where kids are getting feedback from each other, like in a Socratic circle. Here's just a sampling of some of the examples. First one is, how do you make connections? Do the exit card during the lesson. Stop every 10 to 15 minutes and have kids solidify the learning. It might be as simple as just recalling and defining, maybe drawing something, or it could be something that they're given a question at the beginning of the lesson, they build their responses, so by the time they hand in their exit card, they've got a good, rich response. Another example, I love this, it was posted on X, on when Twitter was X, no, before Twitter was X. And this teacher just had a worksheet for her kids. It helps your students who struggle with language development, your English language learners, maybe some of your special education students. The standard they're working on is at the top. You'll notice that specific vocabulary that's most important is listed, and then kids take notes by saying it another way. They might even draw little pictures. It helps them remember and process the information while they're taking notes. The teacher is taking notes, but everybody's notes don't have to look the same. And this is actually in the book with a template. Here they're recalling, they're defining, they're connecting. Building schemas, you're going to love this. It's called Three Truths and a Lie. Kids write 4 statements about, for example, this isn't just a vocabulary word, but other students have to figure out which one is the lie and which ones are true. And so they start with having to recall and make connections and explain which one doesn't belong and why it doesn't belong. And if they have to provide supporting evidence for it, it bumps it to a 3. Now, it doesn't have a broad scope, but it's a more fun way to solidify your understanding of vocabulary words. One last one is about generating questions. And I like this strategy called TQE. It was developed by Marissa Thompson. And the idea is students work in small groups. They discuss something they're reading and they come up with thoughts about it, interpretations, questions they have about it. And then they write them all on the board and the class decides or the teacher decides which one are they all going to discuss first. So it's really giving the students opportunity to drive the learning. Templates, I've provided just a couple templates here. It's the epiphany part. Now, what's my takeaway from this? That comes after the locating details, explaining, discussing. This is just how one teacher structured it for a novel. Another template, this teacher has kids highlight different color for a question, different color for a thought, and so on. And then finally, I'll zip through um, the richness of the last module. I define an actionable assessment as questions that uncover thinking, not just what kids remember. If you know what they're thinking, you can figure out how close they're getting to the learning target. And then you can give them actionable feedback. You can help them learn more about themselves as learners because this is metacognitive and learn more about the content. So an example might be as simple as kids are putting sticky notes up, they're talking in a group. I can see what they're thinking. I can pose a question to them. I can help to move their learning forward. There are a couple of design tools. I have one for analyzing formative assessments. This is important because that's mostly what teachers do every day. They first look to see, does this assessment match the learning target? Is there a reasoning question on my formative assessment? And a lot of teachers are always going to have skills. They're always going to have concepts, and very rarely do they have a reasoning question. Add a reasoning question. And then at the bottom, they have to decide, what am I going to do if kids can do this? And what am I going to do if they don't understand this? And then there's a summative assessment set of questions. So this is done in peer teams. They look, does this assessment address an essential question or a big idea? Does the scoring rubric and the assessment match the standards? Have you balanced DOK levels? And I have some suggestions in this section of how to balance DOK levels. Really, DOK2 is very important. It's conceptual understanding. It should be a chunk of your summative assessments. And I've got some guidelines for that. Is there a real world context being applied here? Does it provide student ownership? Can students own some of that test? Can they answer? Can they provide their epiphany after they tell you, after they summarize the text they read? Is it fair to all students? There are some universal design questions that you can look at and clean up some of the language. And then have you finished both the product and the processes of learning? And that comes when students are self-assessing, getting peer assessment. They're creating a portfolio. So I'd like to stop there and ask, oh, I have one more slide. The last piece about this assessment is that cognitive demand is the potential for what kids are going to have to do to complete a task. Strategic scaffolding is about how can I help kids access the content or access the task at hand. So accessing the content might be teaching students how to annotate a text so that they slow down and understand what that text says. Now you can do a task like a critical analysis of that task because now you understand the content. Those are different types of scaffolding strategies. So my whole bottom line is if you're going to be systematic, then that's when implementation will occur and student-centered learning is a possibility. Because lots of people do rigor randomly, but we're not going to have any more random acts of rigor. So let me open it up to any questions people might have. Okay, so some people are mentioning the FAIR model. Anything that helps students organize ideas around if you're not familiar with that, you take a vocabulary word and then you have different lenses to look at that vocabulary word. But there are no, keep asking a chain of whys. I like, oh, that was going back to that other. So I'm not hearing any questions.
Karen, thank you so much. Such a wonderful, detailed presentation. It looks like we just got in another question from Nathan.
Okay.
if you want to take a look at that. I was also going to say we have some questions that some people asked when they registered, so maybe we can fit in one or two of those uh, before we sign off. But let's start with Nathan, who says,
Okay.
"I'm interested in your thoughts about pace in the student-centered learning, i.e., voice, choice, pace, place. I worry that if pace is centered in a systemic vision, collaboration is undermined."
Yeah. So here I just did a couple of workshops, three of them, three webinars last Friday, and this question came up. So what I talk about is there are times to adjust the pacing. I think the best way is to use stations. And I'm not talking about station rotation. Station rotation is where everybody visits every station at some point during the week. I'm talking about station differentiation. So at one point, you say some kids need a little bit more teacher time, other ones can go on ahead or expand their thinking. And those are good ways to kind of catch the class up on pace. I always remember Grant Wiggins saying, when you run a marathon, you don't run every mile the same way. And I think that's a way to pace the whole structure so that some kids maybe require a little bit more direct instruction. While some kids, I used to, as a teacher, say, I had kids that needed me every day, but there were other kids that needed me to check in with them every other day or every third day. So a station can provide the structure for kids to be given information, for example, like an editing structure. There's a station for them to work together and give peer feedback and be editing their writing while another group is getting direct instruction. Now they're kind of getting caught up. So I think um, stations that are differentiated is a good way to start.
Great.
Okay,
Maybe one that we received ahead of time before we sign
sure.
off for the day.
Yeah, great.
Gianna asks, how does teacher cognition play a role in this? What does the teacher need to attend to?
Well, I think it's interesting. I've had this conversation with um, Jay McTighe and Tom Gutsky and people like that. And I said, what has to come first? The belief that all kids can learn, this is the right way to do it, or some good strategies, practical strategies. And I kind of go back and forth on this, but I think teachers need to be reflective about their practice. I think if they work in a collaborative team, might be a PLC, it might be a grade level team, they have a better opportunity to talk through why did this assessment work well? How come your kids did better on this assessment than my kids did? Let's talk about it. So I think those are pieces of it. But I think if teachers don't have clear examples of how to do it, then it's going to be hard. All I have is a theory. Yeah, I believe all kids can learn, but I'm a kindergarten teacher. I don't really believe that. So here's what I would say is reflective practice is the power. Building relationship with kids is the power. And I'll just end with this thought because I've been saying it a lot. First the hook, then the book. If you want kids to be engaged, you have to hook them on a personal level first. Personal, I'm going to get you interested by my essential question or my the anticipation guide or some experience before I do direct teaching. And the more you hook them on a personal level and then circle back to find out what what did you learn? When you say what you're learning is important, that's when you know that they have learned. So there are some resources. If you contact me at my website, I have more that go with the book. So if you're doing PD with teachers, but you can download the Sketchnote success criteria as a worksheet and I have teachers go through a unit that they have and try to identify because they have samples of success criteria. Thanks for all the positive comments from people I know and people I don't know. And then
Yes.
go
Oh,
ahead. This is
please go
the
ahead.
discount. No, I was going to say this is the discount code. If you wanted to say anything else about that.
Yes, please, everyone, remember to make note of the discount code. It's really a good opportunity to get a discount on this really valuable resource. Thank you, as Karen said, for everyone's lively participation in the chat. And thank you so much, Karen, for a really fascinating presentation. Any final words from you?
No, but just thanks to all those wonderful comments. I mean, I create stuff like I'm a teacher. So I just this is a book for teachers to teach their kids, but to teach each other. So if you find it useful, I see that some people are using some of the activities in the book. And thank you for the people. I mean, Lori Gagno is on here. She contributed a little scenario, and Nate did, and Norm did, and people all over the country have said this is a way that I've used it. And so make it your own. Make it your own.
Great. Great. Well, thank you everyone for being here. We'll wind down for today. Uh, Thank you very much and bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.